I think the line goes, and now for something completely different. Not totally different, but my work focuses a lot on people and how people behave around software artifacts. So all of these talks touch on that to one degree or another. Also, if you're bored, I'm only going to linger on every slide for 30 seconds or less, because I think that's about how much time I have to get through this. And finally, there were a lot of things I would like to tell you about this topic of awareness and trust, and there just simply isn't time. So I picked two things. I'm going to start off with some work that some of you have seen before, just to orient you in my perspective, and then some new work that we were doing. Okay, and I definitely want to acknowledge my team. This is the team a couple of years ago, and this was at the height of when we were analyzing like tons of interviews and field work, and all of these people contributed in one way or the other. My group's changing a lot now. As you can see, I kind of annotated some of the people who've gone off to places like postdocs at Penn State and CMU or companies. And some of the faces will look familiar to those of you who come regularly to the forum. And of course, the funding, academics have to put together lots of little pieces of funding to do their work, and I'm grateful for all of that. Okay, like I said, if I do basically 30 seconds a slide, I should be just fine, maybe even a little under. So, a very simple example to start off, working at a distance. I think that's becoming very common to most of us, even people who are located more or less in the same city or the same company in the same city. Somebody's working at home or something like that. And in more common examples or more dramatic examples, you might be working with someone in another state or another country. So I work a lot with people in Germany. And so when everything's going fine, we're all quite happy, right? But what happens if the guy in Germany gets sick and I start not hearing from them? Do I know what's going on? You know, how do I react? We're working more or less in isolation from one another. Hey, what if I go to a party? Maybe I think instead of being sick, I guess that he might be there, or it's just nighttime there, or the hours are different. So work is becoming, as I think just about everybody in this room understands, more and more distributed geographically, or even in very close locales. We're just working in different places. Isolation, though, prevents knowing what others are doing. We don't see one another. Lack of awareness also prevents knowing why they're not doing something or what they are doing at that time. And then distance prevents familiarity. Just kind of personal familiarity, as well as just understanding their professional capabilities and interests. So what do we do about those problems? And can we make this distribution or this distance matter less? And three of the themes in my work are awareness, trust, and software tool support. I'm very optimistic about technology. I always look for some kind of solution once we're observing problems, but also look for problems that are taking place in the field. So let's start with awareness. And to date, and this is over the last several years, to date we've studied, in the last several years, 5 software development projects, or 5 organizations, large organizations, some with 3,000 people, some of the teams were 30 to 50 people. And they were doing all kinds of different projects, non-modular legacy software, or sometimes they were following good rules about reuse and reference architectures. So all kinds of different teams. And some were working for, we started looking at recently some teams working for outsourcing, and some were just distributed multinationally. So this has led to us over several years. We've had about 100 interviews we've done in the field, and a lot of field work where we've observed what people are doing, looked at the kinds of artifacts they're working with in their cubicles, for example. And then we follow a method that some of you will know already, a grounded theory approach or an ethnographic style of work. So doing the interviews, looking at what the data is telling us and where it's leading us. And so one of the places it led us to is trying to understand this problem of awareness. How do I know the people that I'm working with, what they're doing, what do I know about them? And so we defined this term, the awareness network, to talk about that set of people you might be involved in. And some of my research papers go into more depth about this, but there becomes a problem that who do you keep track of in a project? Sometimes it's not quite so obvious, especially if the person you usually talk to might be absent that day. And then who's keeping track of you, and what do you have to do so that they can keep track of you better? So some of the work practices we saw in some major organizations that we went into were people were reading everything, especially newcomers. They were going through emails, design documents, problem reports, change reports, looking at who put their name to things and trying to get a sense of who then they might talk to. You might do things like email people or ask among your immediate colleagues, your personal network in the organization, to ask who you might talk to. And then some managers set up ad hoc tools to keep track of who is working on what at any given time. And of course, those kinds of tools often get out of date. Okay, so just one of the things we did with that information was think about, well, what kind of software tool support could we provide that might make some of these problems a little easier. So this is the part that some of you I know have seen before. This system we've since dismantled, but this is what it looked like when it was set up in our lab. It's a very abstract kind of overview of who all is working with the project, all the modules they're touching, and then using colors to show the different connections. This is the overview screen, which is it gives you a sense of the complexity of the people involved and the modules that they're working with. And then, of course, to make any use of that, I mean, obviously when you're standing there in the room, you can see more details, but to make better use of that, you can set up different kinds of filters, look at who's touching which modules, for example, or which modules are being produced by whom and consumed by who else. Let's get my whom's and who else's mixed up. I should read the book you were talking about. So you can do these different kinds of tasks easily. The Ariadne tool didn't bias you what you should do. It tried to give you an overview and then let you look into things that you saw in the visualizations. So this is often called a socio-technical system, at least in the software arena. And then we found some success with using this to answer these basic questions, and we found that the visual approach was quite useful that way. You could do things like identify colleagues, perceive situations that could lead to potential bottlenecks, and avoid conflicts. So we started getting interested in tools and seeing some promise in how tool support could solve basic problems of awareness. Well, what about other problems coming from that situation where you would be working in isolation? And trust was one of them. So one simple example I gave of trust is if the colleague doesn't respond, you know, what's going on there? Are they sick? Are they at a party? Is it just a holiday in that country? How do I know what's going on? Well, when you start making these kinds of judgments, which are easy to do, they're called attributions. But a lot of the attributions that we make are not necessarily founded on facts because we don't necessarily have the information about what's going on. So if we could develop a way for participants in a distributed project to have a better sense of what's going on, what the situation is, would they make more accurate attributions or assessments of what others are doing? And could, as a result, could developers then trust one another better? So trust has been studied in management and a couple of other domains that we've looked at. Attached at the end, I won't be going over it, but I attached to this set of slides a pretty extensive bibliography, annotated bibliography of the different areas we researched to look at different definitions of trust and trust in different settings. But one conclusion that's very common is that trust is very important to collaboration, especially in distributed collaborations. And these are some of the common things that you read about. It enhances team productivity, helps the team manage uncertainty and complexity, promotes information exchange, fosters innovation. So these are a lot of the kinds of positive really good feel-goods about trust. And we've observed them in the interviews that we've done as well. But what does that mean to develop trust? Now, I can't tell you about everything we've done. We've done a lot of field work where we talk about trust and culture. We've done studies where we've looked at how knowing only personal information enhances trust without knowing anything about the person's competency or expertise. Very interesting kinds of things that you start to find as you delve into trust. Well, one thing I wanted to tell you about today was a project recently completed by my graduate student, Eric Trainer, for his dissertation. And so after all the field work, all the kinds of explorations and prototyping we did, the Ariadne work, we decided Eric developed a tool that we wanted to see if it could affect people's trust, and in particular through making them more aware of the situation their colleagues was in, trying to improve the accuracy with which they made these kinds of attributions. And we wanted to be as realistic as possible. We needed a controlled experiment to learn the things that we wanted to. So we had access to 28 graduate students, as not uncommon when you do these kinds of experiments at the university. But we were very fortunate we could also bring in 12 professional software developers. And just jumping ahead a little bit about this, when we got our results, we also did comparisons to see if the professional developers behave the same as the students, and we were able to find that there was no difference in their behavior. So that allowed us to then extrapolate that, okay, our results are 40 subjects strong. And I'll give you a sample of the results. So this paragraph here, you don't necessarily have to read it all, but we're taking this from our field work. And it's the kind of situation where someone's supposed to do something, check in something, and they just hadn't done it, and they're not answering your emails. Anyone ever been in that situation?
No.
Oh, no, not at all, yeah. Whether you're working on paper, or a report, or like the conference I'm organizing now. But anyway, so this is very common. So the question arises, do you have a very busy colleague? Or do you have a not so busy colleague who maybe is not behaving in the most forthright or professional or way to use nice words? So these two visualizations are simplified widgets to talk about different things like the activity load, how many tasks are being assigned to you, what your working hours are, how those working hours overlap. Some of these widgets give things more explicitly, some literally in text, and some give the information more visually, as you can see. So, given the different conditions, and I'm abbreviating this very quickly, again, there's Eric's dissertation, and also we have just submitted a paper about this to give some of the details. But what you're seeing in this graph is 4 conditions. So we did a baseline just to see that what people would think if they had no information at all. So we wanted a baseline on our population, So they were somewhat, I'll interpret the muse and things for you here. On the leftmost box, that's representing the fact that people were somewhat generous in their interpretation. They were being kind to their colleague, that, oh, there's probably a good explanation. In technical terms, that's sometimes called a situational attribution. In the other settings, we find that the information provided by the tool helped them more accurately decide, was it the situation, or was there some dispositional kind of behavior going on? Was the person just slacking off? So it's maybe a little hard to get this in the few seconds I have. I can say more about it later, or give you some references to have a look at this. But in any case, what I'm trying to say is the direction of these graphs are going in the right direction, and the more the situation was just somebody slacking off, the easier it was for them to interpret that with accuracy in Theseus. So Theseus as a tool was able to affect the accuracy, improve the accuracy with which people were making these attributions, and it turns out that it also affected their level of trust in the way that we had hoped that they would be more trusting when they understood the situation. So I've teased you a little bit with some data about that. Like I was saying, there are many other ways we've studied trust, but just from this situation, just from this study, Theseus resulted in higher perceived trustworthiness, more accurate attributions, and we did some other kinds of analyses to determine the usability of the tool and how people were engaged with it. From this work with Ariadne, but also with some other software tools, previous work I'd done with Andre Vanderhoek several years ago, and with this most recent work on Theseus, we thought a lot about what a design space would look like for tool support for awareness and trust. And as these things go, this is very abstract design space, but it gives you a sense of the dimensions that we're looking at. What we created here was a three-dimensional space for now of trust factors, so information, attributes from the literature that we learned would support trust, collaborative traces, I didn't talk much about, but information you can data mine from people's online activity and collaborations, like check-ins and check-outs. Lots of repositories about that. We're studying other kinds of information you can data mine now, which Oliver can speak more about. And then we also studied what were the common visual representations, at least with software tools, for these kinds of awareness tools. So this is just an abstract space that we write about in one paper. And then to conclude, I always like to talk a little bit about my research method because I do believe in this strongly, that I really like to observe what's going on in the workplace. You have to study the literature, what other people have done before. I still am very optimistic about technology supporting and solving some of these problems, hypothesize systems. But once you build systems, you often have to go back to the laboratory to determine things in a more controlled setting. And some of you may have already seen Oliver's poster, but you can see it if you just came in for the afternoon. It's going to be up again, but we're also doing some mathematical modeling too. But in all of these cases, we try to link back to the real data we observed, especially our field data. So awareness is key to coordinated work. I think a lot of us have personal experience with that, but it also provides a fruitful way to begin to study or understand trust and potentially software tool support for affecting trust among collaborators. And there are many more results and contexts to explore. I ran, with my colleagues, I ran a workshop at the Computer Supported Cooperative Work Conference earlier this year. And the workshop was just on trust. We had people from emergency management coming in and talking about how they're looking at trust. We had other people looking at software and commitment. So the community is growing, and I'm really positive about this because I think it's a big problem needing to be studied from many different angles. Okay, thanks. 17 minutes.
Questions for David?
Okay.
So have you focused much on turning awareness into action? And your example there about the non-responsive project participant made me think, well, there were probably indicators in advance of the go silent moment that would lead you to predict that he was going to vanish or whatever was the problem. And so you could turn some of that early awareness into a course of action to prevent the later behavior. Have you worked with that at all?
Well, I think in the older tool...
David, could you summarize the question?
Yeah, so the question, and correct me if I summarize this too briefly, but are there other signals you can pick up on earlier and anticipate some of these?
Turn it into a plan of action. Turn awareness into action.
Yeah, so to turn awareness into a plan of action. Well, I think our earlier work with the Ariadne system that tried to do that, because if you could see that one person was involved in so many modules or had so many other people dependent on them, if I were a manager, I would look into that and figure out how to move that work around it, or at least create some redundancy for that person if I couldn't. So some of these visualizations give you a kind of overview that you might not have if you are certainly if you're just one person in a project. So just to keep my answer brief, the Ariadne system did that a little bit. There's a curious way these signals come up in work like Theseus, because how do you decide on an attribution? This is not exactly your question, but different people's habits are different. So the norm, or the expected norm we discovered in the literature for answering emails, is 24 hours. But someone might be a 48-hour sort of person. But the cues in Theseus, they could tell you that the person was a 48-hour email person. And so in that sense, your plan of action would be to take no action until at least 48 hours have passed. I think there's other directions that this can go. We have a paper, the CSCW conference was in February. We have a paper about how people could repair breakdowns. And repairing breakdowns are kind of an action you can take when you know something's going wrong. So that's a little bit towards your question, but very, very interesting question. There were a bunch of other questions. Yeah?
How does what you're doing relate to stuff like Kanban tools and Kanban tools and like rational team and
okay. Some of the
What's
rational work I've been exposed to, and they're trying to make also give a sense of awareness, but I don't know the first one.
Kanban?
Yeah.
Kanban?
Kanban?
The Japanese system?
Kanban, isn't it?
Yeah, the Japanese pull card system that, for like part suppliers.
Okay.
Well, they
I'd
put a
like
bulletin board with with tasks and relations between tasks.
Okay, I haven't looked at that, but I've looked at other systems where you try to put up the big display. If people are working in cubicles, but they're all in one room, there have been experiments where there's a big display that when you walk in, you see the status of everything. So that sounds a little bit more like what you're talking about. And then that's kind of interesting to a researcher from issues of privacy, and my student Oliver, who's here, likes to study punishment and reward, is another angle that you have to study with that. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of a follow-up on that. Are you considering, this is kind of horizontal awareness and trust. Are you thinking about studying vertical trust? Because there could be reactions to feeling like all your activities are being monitored and actions being taken. For instance, one place I used to work, when you had to charge your hours to different task numbers, there was a category that they wanted you to use called unproductive work hours. Nobody would put that down because there was no way to put overtime hours to even that out.
Reminds me of working in the government, yes. We've looked at different stakeholders being part of this, and our visualizations so far have been proofs of concept. And as you saw, the Theseus tool is definitely not anonymous. You know exactly who's responding where. I don't have a good solution for the vertical thing in the hierarchy. I do know a lot of companies, unfortunately, are requiring that you just be transparent. And then some research is also looking at totally transparent software development. And I do have the concern to have them. Yeah.
Do you take into consideration like explosive modeling, like that actually that most of the stuff you do doesn't really matter, but then one person comes up with one idea that explodes and everything changes, and everyone has to start making changes around that? Does that go into your? Because it seems very linear. Pick some work on some work, but a lot of people there's kind of this explosive idea where everything changes.
And then a rapid behavior.
Yeah. So.
No, because the kinds of organizations we were studying were, I don't want to say they were exactly top down, but they were more specification driven and deciding things ahead of time and then farming out APIs as such. But I am kind of interested in what's going on there in a little more, like a more agile process, for example.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, yeah. I've become interested in that. I've talked to some of the students who come from an Agile area, and maybe offline we can talk about some of the things that I've learned there. Okay.
One last question? You takers?
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you very much, David.